Talking to David Zetland about his recent book, Living with Water Scarcity. David, droughts and floods are a natural part of the climate regime in most parts of the world. Now, with climate change, we expect more variability in rainfall, and this variability become more extreme over time. So, if there are flood warnings on the TV, why should people be worrying about water scarcity?
Right. So that's because next week there'll be water scarcity on the TV. I think the whole idea of climate change, and you could say we're emitting greenhouse gases that's causing global warming, that's changing the weather, and that will show up in the records as a changed climate. So what we're talking about is greenhouse gases are heating up the atmosphere, which is changing the weather in terms of speeding up the hydrological cycle. And that means it's going to be more rain in a shorter period, or a longer duration of no rain, or hotter temperatures in the summer, or colder winters, and so on. There's more variation. And if you are seeing more floods in some locations, then almost by definition you're going to see more droughts in other locations. And what we need to do in terms of worrying about droughts or floods is build bigger buffers into our system. So we have a buffer of this much built up over several hundred years of dealing with water flows, and now we need to have this much in terms of buffers. We need to be able to deal with more variation in this whole space, and that means in some cases bigger dams or more storage, underground storage. It means potentially moving people out of areas because they're going to become too hot. Old people die, for example, when it gets so hot. So, or changing crop patterns because the crops might not be able to take peak temperatures, or they might not be able to handle precipitation events. So these disruptions are going to be happening in lots of places, and that's what we want to have, is a system that handles the whole variation from dry to too wet.
And you mentioned in that building larger dams, and I guess there are a lot of other infrastructure focused ways in which to deal with variability. Are there any natural ways of dealing with this in terms of say environmental management and bioengineering?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I'm one of the last people to say build more big dams. We have built many dams in Australia and most developed countries. The United States for sure. That was the subject of Cadillac Desert, a fantastic book. There was too much infrastructure built, too many dams built. The World Bank was famous for building dams anywhere you could shake a stick at. So in some cases, we have plenty of dams. It might make sense to raise some dams in terms of their storage capacity. Building new dams is not necessarily what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is having the need to store more water. One of the areas which has been totally underemphasized for interest, I don't know why actually, is underground water storage, aquifers, storing water in groundwater. The benefit of that is that you don't necessarily have to build a big concrete thing. And it doesn't necessarily evaporate, so it'll stay there for a long time even though it's hot. In terms of other natural features and what's called natural infrastructure or green infrastructure, besides the underwater storage or underground storage, you can have rivers that are going to be wide, and they'll be allowed to run in a wider range of flows. So their peak flood area, they'll be able to flood without taking out a village or a city, which is what's happened we've had floods that have taken out in the last couple of years, everywhere. Brisbane, Calgary, Bangkok, Central Europe, many cities in Central Europe. Budapest, I was in Budapest where they nearly had overtopping of their wall last year. So what this means in terms of the higher variations is you need to give the rivers more room to carry a bigger volume of water. And that means, in a sense, ecosystem restoration, or getting out of the way, getting houses away from riverfront property, or away from, in the case of rising sea levels, shoreline property on the oceans. And that leaves more space for nature, in a sense, to expand and contract, which is going to happen, without doing as much damage to humans who were built up infrastructure and housing and so on based on past water flows.
And you mentioned there, I guess, the idea of moving people out of the way from floods, and potentially also changing crop patterns. And an extension to that might be actually moving agriculture out of areas where it's not really viable anymore. Now, this is something which is quite interesting from the perspective of insurance, but can be quite challenging because there are different people, say people who are living next to a river as opposed to ones that are living further away, who have different risks from an insurance perspective. What do you think is the best way for governments to be able to manage this variable insurance in private markets?
Well, first of all, the government should let it happen. There is a huge problem, existing problem, in many countries, not just the United States, and I don't think it's a problem in Australia. Let's keep separate two things here. There's insurance for farmers, or agricultural insurance, and there's insurance for homeowners in terms of catastrophe kind of problems. The simple idea in both cases is that both farmers and homeowners should be required to buy insurance against weather-related catastrophe and floods, respectively. If they are required to do so, then a farmer who is growing a reasonably conservative crop in a reasonably temperate area is going to have low insurance. A farmer who is growing a high water-using crop in an area that's subject to drought will pay a higher premium for the insurance. A homeowner who lives next to a river is going to pay more insurance than a homeowner who lives on top of a hill in terms of flooding. So the insurance prices can help people understand the risk that they are bearing, and insurance companies are extremely aware of this. The problem is that the government, because of a law against insurance or subsidies to insurance, has blunted those signals to farmers and to homeowners. In the worst case, the government will come and, as they did in Calgary and Alberta, the government will say, you are flooded by the river overflowing, we will rebuild your house at no cost because we're the government and we care about you. What this means is people are living right in a floodplain again, and they'll be flooded again. And the government has made that possible. And on from a financial perspective, maybe the government is paying for it, but people are suffering and people are dying because of these subsidies from the government. The same thing can be said about farmers if they are getting subsidies to grow, for example, corn or wheat or soya, which are big program crops. I know Australia is not guilty of this, and this is amazing, and I give amazing props to Australia for reforming their agricultural regime back in the 80s. But in the United States and in Europe, if you grow corn and the crop fails, the government will give you money. There's no incentive to grow the crop which is going to be robust against bad weather. There's no incentive to even grow a crop which people want to buy in the market. The government is basically saying, we'll take care of you if there's a disaster, and we'll buy your corn if there isn't. And so the government subsidies are making the problem worse instead of better.